אוקיי, טוב. ועכשיו קצת באופן יותר רציני, נעבור לרועי אושרוב. ונעבור לאנגלית. רועי is the author of The Art of Unit Testing and Elastic Leadership. And he is working on his new book, Pipeline Driven, to be released in 2021. So, רועי, נעבור לעברית. שלום ומה נשמע?
שלום, hello. Can you hear me?
מה אתה אומר לרעיון? היית מקבל אותה?
זה היה מאוד מעניין, אני אקרא לזה.
טוב, אז בכיף ובחדווה אני מעביר לך את השידור כדי שתוכל להקסים אותנו כדרכך.
Well, thank you very much, Danko, and it's a pleasure to be here at Agile Infinity Conference. I have to admit it's quite, it's always good to get out of your comfort zone and try to do things that you've never done before. And I've definitely never done before this type of thing where it's kind of a rolling news media outlet. So we're going to try to do it a bit more, interactive. We have 20 minutes. Let me just put my timer on. That's nice. And I can also see the chat. So if you have questions in the chat, I will try to answer them live. But before we start answering things, the topic I'm going to talk about today is pipeline-driven organizations. And let me just share my screen so you can see things better. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So hopefully you should be able to see my screen right now and write down in the chat if you have any type of issue. What we're able to see, let me just make sure that you're able to see the screen. So let me know if you can see the presentation. Zoom is always kind of weird about that stuff. So just type it in the chat, folks. Perfect. Thank you, Gadi. Okay, so pipeline-driven organizations is kind of a weird subject, so I'll explain a bit where I'm coming from. I've been working as a consultant and and as a developer and team lead for over 20 years, and there are some patterns relating to continuous delivery that I keep seeing, and I'm currently, writing a book about those patterns. Which you can see at pipelinedriven.org, some of the progress on that book and the blog posts. And the book is going to be called Pipeline Driven. And the reason I'm writing this book is because everybody's talking about DevOps and nobody's actually talking about continuous delivery. Nobody's talking about what actually makes it happen in organizations. And when we're talking about agile development, continuous delivery and extreme programming are the oil in the wheels that make that stuff go. What are we actually trying to achieve with all of these, dynamic reteamings and all of these sprints and all of these estimations? What are we actually trying to achieve? And I would say that one of our best goals to achieve is continuous delivery. And when we see organizations try to implement continuous delivery, a lot of times we see organizations fail. We see them fail bigly, basically, as one of the presidents says. So in this short segment, we're just going to talk about waterfall pipelines versus cooperative pipelines and what's the difference. What do companies like the Netflixes of the world, why are they successful in implementing continuous delivery and so many other companies not successful? What's the difference? What does it mean to trust our pipelines? What does it mean in terms of the organization to actually work in that type of culture? And if you have any questions, you can just keep the questions ongoing in the chat. Okay, so I want to differentiate between the idea of continuous delivery and true continuous delivery, which is what organizations like the Netflixes and the Googles and the Facebooks, they're actually able to achieve that stuff. But a lot of organizations say that they have continuous integration and continuous delivery, but really a lot of times what it means is that it takes them still a long time to deliver, and their organization is filled with bottlenecks. What type of bottlenecks? Well, here's a simple example. a lot of organizations say, well, we're fully automated. We have Jenkins, we have, TeamCity, we have a bunch of stuff. We have Azure DevOps. So we're all automated here. So what usually happens, especially in larger organizations, is that developers will have their own pipelines that run on specific merges to specific branches. And those pipelines runs a bunch of tests. But then there are sometimes QA pipelines that run their own automated pipelines, and then QA gets to decide whether the branch should be merged to the next branch. And then we have an ops pipeline or infrastructure for deployment. Sometimes we even have security pipelines. And all of these things are automated on their own separately. But notice that there are people in the middle between each and every pipeline. People are still bottlenecks in all of these things. So the difference between those organizations and the Netflixes, for example, is that usually in the more advanced organizations, there are no people between the different pipelines. In fact, we can say that it's organizational pipeline between dev, test, sec, compliance sometimes, ops. All of these things can be considered one big pipeline for delivery. And if you have a bunch of people in the middle of the pipeline, then basically that's what I call a waterfall pipeline, because people represent bottlenecks in the pipeline. And not only that, the further you get away inside the pipeline, each person that has to make a decision whether we should continue on to the next level basically takes on the responsibility of all the people before them, which means there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of psychological pressure. And if you've ever been in a position, if you've ever seen a QA lead that has to sign off on a release that says, well, I swear, and here's my blood, that this release specifically is gonna be okay, or I swear in my blood that this release is still not okay, and it's the fourth time, what type of pressure does that give people? So what happens is that people basically, they burn out, or they have no idea really all the things that happened before them. So they take even more time to sign out or sign up for the next stage, because they're afraid of all the responsibility that they're taking on themselves for something that they can't really truly appreciate all the complexity of. And we also have to distinguish that between those different pipelines, between all of those stages, we have a bunch of judgments. And those judgments can be tactical or strategic. So a strategic judgment would be, what are we building? What is the right feature to build? But a tactical judgment or a tactical decision is, should we merge something, etc. So if we what we're actually saying is that we're putting people in charge of making a lot of tactical day-to-day decisions that we can actually let the pipelines make a decision instead. And that's kind of a scary notion, because a pipeline that makes a decision for us is a pipeline that we actually have to trust. But let's assume that we're able to create such a pipeline. Then we can start parallelizing things. We can actually make things faster. We can organize and reorganize and even refactor the pipelines and refactor our definition of done to delivery in different ways if people weren't part of the equation for the tactical day-to-day decisions inside an automated pipeline. And the way this usually works, and this is what I call a cooperative pipeline, is that in those true continuous delivery companies, we have different segments of the population in the organization contributing decision-making abilities into the pipeline. So basically, it's the responsibility of dev and test and compliance, etc., and ops to contribute tasks into the pipeline, and those tasks can either fail or pass. So for example, security will contribute security tests. Ops will contribute not just the deployment scripts, but also tests for infrastructure as code. Developers might contribute unit tests, end-to-end tests, automation. QA a lot of times will contribute various types of things, or sometimes QA will become developers all on their own and contribute different types of tests. And lastly, we have this kind of notion that if everyone is just contributing to this one big pipeline, and all of the tasks that we put in the pipeline pass, they automatically make the judgment for us. So they basically represent us. The security tests that I wrote represent the knowledge of the security people in the organization, but they're fully automated. It's not that big of a deal, technically, if we think about it, because security organizations already have a suite of automated tests. Usually they have a bunch of stuff that they can do automatically. They just are not connecting their own pipeline into the main company pipeline. And we can find a way to automate most tactical day-to-day decisions. And that's what I argue that the Netflixes of the world actually do. They remove people from their pipelines. And that's the difference between strategic versus tactical. Strategic is what do we build, and tactical could be, can I deploy it? Should we merge this branch to the next branch? Is it secure enough? Does it work? All of these things that technically we could find a way to get the pipeline to make the judgment for us. And for that, and that's why it's so scary, it actually requires us to trust the pipeline. Because if I do a lot of coaching about extreme programming and continuous delivery. And when I go to a company and I suggested them that they release if the pipeline is green, or they deploy if the pipeline is green mostly, and they don't deploy if the pipeline is red, a lot of companies, a lot of the answers you're going to get in organizations is, seriously, are you crazy? I don't trust the pipeline that much, that if it's green, everything is okay, and if it's red, everything is not okay. So they'll put people in charge. And that is a sign that we're not giving enough of a position to the pipeline inside the organization. And that's why I call it a pipeline-driven organization. And in a pipeline-driven culture, what it means is that we spend 20, 30% of our time working on the pipeline, teaching the pipeline new skills so that the pipeline can make better and better judgments. And that's part of our work. It's like a Zen garden, it's like a bonsai tree, in that all of us contribute to the different stages of the pipeline. And it's part of our work. It's part of our definition of done, is that if I'm building a feature, the pipeline can also judge whether the feature is working or not working, whether it's mergeable, whether it's secure, et cetera, et cetera. And that helps us reduce a lot of stress from people in the organization. If anyone has any questions, you can write them in the chat. And in that regard, I call this SDLC 2.0, or the Software Development Lifecycle 2.0, which is the next generation of development, which is kind of all of these companies trying to achieve that. And some of you might have already seen this move. And if you're working in the QA department, you've already started feeling the pain of some of this move, even though it's not explicit. But a lot of organizations are removing manual testing or a bunch of manual testing and only leaving exploratory testing. A lot of them are reducing the amount of QA that happens. But the same is going to happen for security. Developers are definitely feeling some of that pain, because developers are required to learn a bunch of new skills, working with pipelines, etc. I'm going to get to it in a second. In that regard, Netflix has had that journey for a while. Netflix in 2013, you can see the agenda at agile8.com. Netflix in 2013 wrote about branch per environment. This is in 2013. I'm just taking it from their blog. And then in 2015, they basically created internally the idea of dynamic pipelines, where the pipeline does a lot of deployments, but there's still a manual judgment where a person actually has to say go, no go. And then in 2018, they removed even that person from their pipelines, and they created automated metrics analysis, or canary analysis. So the person doesn't actually have to say a go, no go based on the results from statistical data that they see after deployment. And basically they have a pipeline that knows when to roll back and when the deployment actually went well. So this is an example of an evolution of a company that started thinking about continuous integration in 2013. And by 2018, they were already publishing posts about fully automated, removing people from the equation. So that's an example of why I think those companies are doing so well. They're removing people from the equations. So the idea of these different skills contributing to the pipeline is one of the biggest pain points that organizations are going to see in the coming future. At least that's what I feel. Developers are already feeling it. They're learning about full stack development and automated testing and infrastructure automation and security and pipeline integration. And they also have to coach other people. And if you're a developer, I'm sure that you've already felt the pain. I've heard a lot of developers saying, why do I need to care about these types of tests? Why do I need to care about how the pipeline works? Why do you need to care about all of these things? And the answer is because that's what a pipeline-driven organization requires of you. And you've also heard different terms being thrown around that try to achieve the same result. So you've heard of DevOps, which is dev and ops working together. You've heard of DevSecOps, which is dev and security and ops working together on the pipelines. There's also test ops. There's going to be AI ops, of course. There's going to be compliance ops. And all of these great terms are going to start popping up. But really what they're all trying to say is that they want to work on a cooperative pipeline. So I call this co-ops, of course, because if you put ops after something, it automatically makes it much cooler. So we have dev, and Netflix called their devs full cycle developers, which is exactly the pain that we're feeling. And full cycle developers do design, development, test, deployment, operations, and support. And they wrote about this in a blog post in 2018 as well. So full cycle development is an example. I call it cross stack development, but full cycle is also a, if Netflix says it, of course it's going to be gospel, right? So ops also have skill challenge. Ops now need to learn not just about, ops used to be just the integration or configuration management, and now everyone calls them DevOps. I don't call them DevOps. Call them ops because that's what their main skill. But they have to learn about infrastructures, code, and automated testing for that stuff, which most of them still haven't learned. They have to learn about coding practices and working in source control correctly and working with those pipelines. And they have to coach development and test and QA and security also have to learn a bunch of stuff. They have to learn how to share their knowledge. And I've been to a few organizations that I coach and I consult with, and they're also going through the security thing now. So it's called SecOps, right? But in this case, it's still the same thing under a different disguise, which is a cooperative pipeline, or at least that's what they're trying to do, but they don't actually have a specific name for it. And we have the testers and the QA, and they, of course, are feeling a lot of pain, and they have to learn about automated testing and coding and infrastructure and pipeline integration. So if you put all of this stuff together, you have these 4 different groups, and there's going to be more that have, I'll put them in different colors because what I wanted you to see is the distribution of different skills that each one of these tribes needs to learn in this coming SDLC 2.0. And that means that each one of them, for example, dev, they have to learn automated testing and good practices. They have to learn it from the QA folks. So QA folks become QA coaches. They have to learn about security. So security has to teach them that stuff. Ops have to teach a bunch of people about infrastructure because everyone has to learn how to support their pipelines. Everyone has to learn how to contribute to the pipeline. So they have to learn how pipelines work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be an interesting future. Whether we like it or not, I think this is the future we're going to see, and we're starting to see already happening. And I think this is really one of those things that it's not really about tooling, it's about people. And that's why I think this makes sense in this type of conference, because how do you get these 4 groups to work together? What type of teaming organizations can you do? What type of politics do you have to work on? How do you actually measure the metrics associated with the success of that type of organization? There's a lot of interesting questions. There's a lot of stuff out there. And yes, definitely it's about people. So as someone, I don't remember who said it, but all software problems are people problems. Absolutely true. Let's see. If you want to learn more about that stuff, you can read my blog at pipelinedriven.org. I've also started doing a lot of live Twitch streaming about various things that I'm doing. And you can follow me on Twitter, etc. So now we still have 1 minute and 30 seconds for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to sit here and just stare at the camera. Let me just stop sharing for a second. Okay, questions to anyone and everyone. Questions will be answered and answers will be questioned. Okay, that's my promise to you. Questions, answers. Okay, well, I guess that's my sign, that's my cue. Did you see in Israel any pipeline-driven company? Yes, there are a couple of those. For example, Wix could be a good example of a pipeline-driven company. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, Roy, who traditionally leads the one pipeline approach, DevOps, product, etc. So in terms of leading this, a lot of times there are different people, organizations that tend to drive this stuff. Sometimes project managers become release managers and they work on getting everyone to work together. But usually it's kind of a grassroots movement, and either development managers try to find a way to do it, or CTOs try to do it from the top down. But I don't think the vocabulary is still there for most people. So if you're actually trying to push that type of approach, it's really important to talk about it with management, because it requires a lot of cooperation. And if you're going to start with that type of stuff, it definitely recommended way to do it to start is to start with a pilot project. Take one team or one product or one feature of a product and build a team around it of people that contribute to that specific pipeline in parallel, because it's this is one of those changes that can take 2 to 3 years to change in a medium company, and even more to change in a large company. And it starts with those pilots everywhere. What is the percentage of the software companies who have true CD? I would say it's less than 5% at this point. That's my feeling. But I don't know that if you look at the DevOps, state of DevOps, I think that the percentage is still definitely less than 20% that say that they do continuous delivery. But when we look at the highest performing organizations, it's a very small percentage. I drew the tests in parallel. How do you parallel the unit tests with end-to-end and security? Good question. I think that if you want to talk about that, I can try to write in the chat, but it takes a bit of time to answer that, and I think we're kind of out of time. But basically, the idea is that you run multiple environments in parallel, and you run the tests in parallel. And Kubernetes makes that easier. Okay, I think that's it. I hope that you enjoyed, and may the force be with you, everybody.